Yeah. Welcome everyone. My name is Mulina and I'm the Victorian convener of the Asian Australian Alliance. I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon. For some of us in Victoria, it is a public holiday and we are particularly thankful to you for giving up your time today. Our webinar today launches the social commentary, racism and COVID-19 report from All Together Now, analysing the racialisation of COVID-19 in mainstream Australian social commentary. Released in partnership with the Asian Australian Alliance, the report explores the ways in which media discussions of COVID-19 have negatively racialized Asian and Asian Australian communities. You will hear from representatives from All Together Now and the Asian Australian Alliance as they discuss the issue of media racism, what it means for the communities, and what can be done to address it. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the land we are all joining from and meeting on today. For me, it is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I want to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today on this webinar. If anyone else on the panel wishes to say something to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which they are joining from today, please feel free to do so now.
Hi everyone, my name's Jen. I'm calling from Darug and Gundungurra country and want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I want to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and Australia always was and always will be Aboriginal land.
Hi everyone, I'm speaking from Sydney and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Hi, I'm Erin. So I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the lands. Because we're joining from different cities and possibly different parts of the world where we are meeting on today, and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and all other Indigenous peoples all around the world who are joining us today on this webinar.
Hi everyone, my name is Thompson. I'm on the traditional lands of the Darug people, and I just wanted to pay my respects to the elders past, present, emerging, and also to any Aboriginal elders and our friends who may be in audience today.
Thank you everyone. Is there anyone else?
I'm Adri and I'm also dialing in from Sydney. I'd also like to pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where I'm joining from today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. If you'd also like to pay respects to traditional owners from where you're joining from, please put it into the comment box and we'd like to hear from you.
Yes, please. Thank you, everyone. I would also like to welcome some notable guests, including Andrew Giles MP, and I know there's a few others who will be joining us. So welcome to all of you. So in terms of housekeeping, our admin today is Cindy Chung, who will be moderating the chat box and question box for commentary and questions. I will be assisting her. There will be a little bit of time for questions at the end, but please contact us at info@asianaustralianalliance.net anytime for any questions or comments. You'll be able to upvote questions you like. Cindy, please say hi in the chat box and switch on your video for a minute, maybe. Do you want to say hi quickly, Cindy?
Oh, hi everyone, I'm Cindy. If you have any question, you can just leave the question in the Q&A chat box, and also if you want to send it to me, and that's all right.
Thank you, Cindy. As we are on a tight schedule, we will ask as many questions as we are able to in the time, and if your question is not asked, we are more than happy to forward it to the relevant panelist and email you the answers. So just in terms of an introduction, before I hand over to our moderator, the Asian Australian Alliance COVID-19 Racism Incident Report, which is still open, recorded more than 500 incidents of racism against Asians and Asian Australian communities during COVID-19, which indicates a sharp rise in racism towards these communities. The report This report today responds to and builds on repeated concerns expressed by various sections of civil society, including in our AA report, particularly the concern that the language used in opinion pieces published in Australian mainstream newspapers can contribute to and perpetuate this racism. This is a great collaboration for two organizations that focus on promoting racial equity through evidence-based projects. We will hear from the panel on what, who is All Together Now, an introduction to the ATN media monitoring, the research methodology used in the report and its finding, the social and cultural context of the findings, and AA's collaboration with the ATN. Our moderator today is Adri Lozano, one of our New South Wales conveners for the Asian Australian Alliance. She will introduce the panelists and conduct the panel. So over to you, Adri. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melina. So just reiterating that we'll have a couple of presentations from our partners at All Together Now. And after this, we'll have a guided, moderated session discussing what the report was about, and then we'd like to open up some questions to the audience. So if you're not familiar with Zoom, if you go to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that there is a chat function and a Q&A function. So Cindy and Melina will be taking a look at these as we go through the presentations. So please enter your questions there and we'll try to incorporate that into our moderated panel or towards the end of the session. I do apologize, we often get a lot of questions coming through, so we will get through as many as we can, but as Melina mentioned, you can always contact us at info@asianaustralianalliance.net and we'll get back to you with further information. So without further ado, we have two presentations today from two of our guests from All Together Now. We have Deliana, who is one of the social research coordinators for the project. She will be talking about the ATN media monitoring research methodology and research findings. And then we'll go to Megan Daly, who also worked on the project as a social researcher, to give us the context of the findings and walk us through what the results were there. So over to you, Deliana, to guide us through the first part of your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adri. My name is Deliana Yacoban. I am, as Adri said, the Media Monitoring Project Coordinator at All Together Now. And I'd like to thank the Asian Australian Alliance for their collaboration and support with this webinar and also with our report. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's watching us or listening to us today. I'll start by saying a few words about All Together Now and how the report we're launching today came about. So All Together Now is a national anti-racism not-for-profit organization. It was established 10 years ago. And we've been running the media monitoring project since 2016, initially as a volunteer-run project, and now as a paid project with funding ending next year. For our research, we partner with University of Technology, Sydney to create our methodology. And we collect and analyze racialized opinion pieces from Australian mainstream newspapers and from current affairs shows. We also analyze readers' comments on news websites. And a really important part of this project is co-designing solutions together with communities targeted by racist media. In this year's report, the one we're launching today, Social Commentary, Racism and COVID-19, we decided to focus on anti-Asian and Asian Australian rhetoric enhanced by the pandemic. And we only included an overview of our yearly research findings as an infographic that you'll see in the report. So we decided to write a case study instead of a yearly findings report. And I'll explain why. As recent research from the Asian Australian Alliance shows, there were at least 377 incidents of racism towards Asian Australian people from April to June 2020. So that's only 1 month. So in this context, we thought it'd be useful to do an in-depth analysis of selected opinion pieces from the mainstream national press and try to lay bare the techniques that these articles use to convey racist sentiments. So in terms of the methodology that we used for this case study, we selected 8 opinion pieces that were reflective of a broader national and international anti-Chinese sentiment during the pandemic. And these articles were published between March and April 2020 in Daily Telegraph, The Australian, and Sydney Morning Herald. These articles also didn't fit neatly in the framework we use for our day-to-day media monitoring because they often blurred quite strongly the lines between legitimate political criticism and racist sentiments. So we try to deconstruct these opinion pieces in the case study using critical discourse analysis, and we identified and described 5 key techniques that mobilized and perpetuated racism. So these 5 techniques are irony, harmful stereotypes, fallacies, intertextuality, and scaremongering. And I'll clarify what each of these techniques revealed in the case study. So the first one, irony, it involved racist mocking of Chinese people and culture, which is a common punching down technique that affects minorities and people who experience racism. Irony was mostly expressed through wordplays and puns that associated COVID-19 with China and with Wuhan. The second technique, harmful stereotypes, the main example here is the comparison made between a so-called good migrant and a bad migrant. So this is a binary that's commonly deployed against Asian communities, both here but also in America. And the takeaway here is that belonging to Australia should not be conditional on someone's so-called performance. And since the pandemic started, we've been seeing this framing of Chinese Australians as being somehow outside of the Australian national identity, despite the fact that these communities have lived in Australia for centuries. The third technique that we identified was the use of fallacies, defined as false or mistaken ideas. And here we came across this idea that calling out racism against Chinese Australians automatically makes you a supporter of communism. And this is an error of logic that when it enters the mainstream, it just creates further problems because it discourages people from speaking up against racism. The fourth technique that we identified was intertextuality. This refers to the complex relationship between different texts. And this was most notably used to keep a topic alive across multiple texts through repetition of the same information. So when racist ideas are repeated, especially on mainstream media platforms, they perpetuate racist discourses and they reinforce racist narratives. And intertextuality was also used to quote other texts that praised one's racist ideas. So what this does is to invoke the popularity of a racist view in order to justify it. And we need to remember that the popularity of an idea has no correlation whatsoever with whether or not it is racist. The last technique that we identified, the fifth one, was scaremongering, which is defined as needless incitement of fear. And it was evident in texts that used the us versus them binary to frame China as this political enemy. And when scaremongering was employed, legitimate political criticism was delivered through this very emotionally charged language, which actually seeks to elicit a fear response in the readers rather than encouraging a rational debate. So these are the 5 techniques that we identified, and I'd like to encourage the people who are watching us now, including the general public, media workers, policymakers, to read the report and use these techniques as tools to support a deepened understanding of racism. I'd also like to add in the end that our report makes two key recommendations. One is that there is a strong need to increase the level of cultural competency and racial literacy within newsrooms and media organizations. And the second recommendation is to increase the level of cultural diversity in mainstream media organizations at all levels. So journalists, presenters, producers, as well as management and executives. I'll stop here and I'd like to hand over to Megan now, because an important part of our analysis is placing the findings and recommendations within the social and cultural context. And Megan will help us understand how these techniques and how this language actually works to codify power structures and reinforce forms of racism.
Hi everyone, so as Deliana mentioned, my name is Megan and I'm representing All Together now. I just wanted to go over some of the cultural and social background that is behind our project. So we were duo academic Josh Gibson used the term supremeness of whiteness to describe race relations in Australia. This idea refers to the mainstream white supremacy in which white ideals, culture and community are privileged at the expense of others. So despite the belief held by some that we live in a post-racial society and the continual framing of Australia as a successful multicultural nation, minorities remain significantly underrepresented in top leadership positions in business and government institutions. The idea of who is and is not an Australian continues to be exclusive and exclusionary. So Australian ideals that have been held up as national values, such as, for example, egalitarianism, are seen as being incompatible with stereotyped Chinese communities. These communities are often orientalized and profiled as profiteering and submissive. In this way, they're seen as other and separate from the national identity. So current anti-Chinese and Chinese-Australian discourse uncovered in our research can actually be seen as a re-emergence of yellow peril anxieties from the 19th century. So we can see this in the re-emergence of stereotypes of Chinese cultural practices as being a source of illness or disease. So this suggests that these sentiments never went away, but rather that COVID-19 has provided an opportunity for them to be outwardly expressed in a public sphere. This is not to say that legitimate political criticism and discussion cannot be had, but to point out that this criticism becomes a risk when it's broadened to essentialize Chinese or Asian Australian people and communities. This is actually an issue that extends beyond our borders. A recent study from Georgia Institution of Technology, for instance, found that individuals who engaged in anti-Asian COVID-19 related discourse online often previously voiced similar racist views prior. This suggests that this rise in anti-Asian sentiments is a worldwide trend. However, due to the large Asian Australian community in Australia, these pre-existing sentiments are something that we need to be aware of while we're attempting to engage in productive discussion about race and current affairs. Additionally, these anti-Asian sentiments go beyond a stigma against Chinese nationals and the CCP and actually extend and impact Asian Australian and Chinese Australian communities. So as mentioned, within the white Australia imaginary, there's a tension between Asian Australian identities and the parameters of national citizenship. There's this idea that these two identities are mutually exclusive, and it remains prevalent as the notion of who an Australian is remains tied to the myth of white Australia that was manufactured by racist policies now supposedly in the past. I saw someone mention in the chat, and I think it's very prevalent. We've just seen a recent example of this when Senator Eric Abetz asked Australian policy expert Osman Chu to denounce the CCP despite him being born and raised in Australia. Additionally, this issue goes beyond affecting the Asian Australian communities and actually affects all minority groups who exist outside of this exclusive form of national identity. Our recommendations, as outlined by Deliana, would directly confront this disparity and hopefully lead towards a realisation of the multicultural values that we claim to uphold as a nation here in Australia. So I think we were moving on to a moderated discussion, if that's...
Yes, thank you so much, Deliana and Megan, for that presentation. Just a reminder that we will be taking questions as part of the moderated talk and then afterwards. So please have a think and put them into the comments or the question Q&A boxes below. So we'll get the ball rolling and I will introduce each of the panelists in turn. So we have Thomson Chung joining us, who is a fellow New South Wales Asian Australian Alliance convener. We have Molina, who is muted at the moment, but let's bring her on. Molina, who is our Victorian Asian Australian Alliance convener. We have Erin Chu, who is our founder and national convener for Asian Australian Alliance. We have Jen McLean, who is project manager at All Together Now. Of course, we have Deliana Yacoban, who is one of the social researchers at All Together Now. And of course, Megan Daly, another social researcher from All Together Now. So we will have a sort of casual discussion here just to go through the findings, talk about our collaboration and our conversations in the space, and delve into the topics a little bit further so that we can all get a better understanding of what the findings are and what they mean. Perhaps to start, it might be good to hear about the shared language, so we're all on the same page. We've talked about the words like racism, covert racism, what it means when something is neutral, when something is inclusive, and when something is negative, and we've used those terminologies throughout the report. If I could ask someone from All Together Now to speak to the terminology and what that means in this context.
I'd be happy to speak a bit about the terminology. So maybe I'll start with defining racism. It's a tricky question. There's not only one definition, but based on existing legislation and literature, we take the definition of racism and as unjust, covert, and overt behavior towards a person or a group on the basis of their racial identity. So that includes their physical aspects, their nationality, their cultural background, which also includes religion. And it's important to note that racism is more than prejudice. It's prejudice with power. So racism is a systemic issue. Racism reinforces white cultural dominance at the expense of other communities. And it's a tool. It's a tool that's used to marginalize and oppress First Nations communities and people of color. And it's a tool that advances colonialism and the exploitation of people who are not white across the world. And maybe I could speak a little bit about covert racism, but keeping in mind that this is applicable to media analysis, so it's within the framework that we work with. So covert racism is, or are more discrete forms of racism that are equally as destructive, but they may be more difficult to spot. And in our methodology, so through existing literature, but also empirical analysis that we've done, it usually includes tactics such as decontextualization, so taking facts out of context, dog whistling, irony, and as we've noted in the current report, it can manifest through harmful stereotyping, fallacies, and scaremongering. And maybe I'll walk us very briefly through what we define to be inclusive, neutral, and negative in our methodology. So we have to note that this definition, at least the definition of negative, draws on the Racial Discrimination Act and the UNESCO Declaration of Race and Racial Prejudice. In opinion media, a negative is a portrayal that is reasonably likely to offend, insult, humiliate, or intimidate another person or group because of their race, color, national, or ethnic origin. And it may also include religious intolerance motivated by racist considerations. Then an inclusive opinion piece would be one that portrays or is a portrayal that promotes racial justice, and it condemns racism, but also defies stereotypes and gives a voice to a minority group to this effect. A neutral opinion piece, that sounds like a bit of a clash, but in this case, it is a portrayal that does not satisfy the other definitions. And we have to note here, and it's very important to note that it does not equate to color blindness. So it doesn't mean that we ignore racial identity altogether, but instead, it might refer to opinion pieces that don't place unnecessary focus on a race of a person or a community, or that don't single out a person or a community based on their race, and that they don't vilify a community based on isolated incidents, let's say. And one last thing that I should note about our research is that we never look at good news stories and bad news stories. So a good story about sports, for example, can still perpetuate racist narratives. Maybe I'll stop there, Adrian.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Deliana. I think that gives us a really strong base for the remainder of our discussion. So everyone tuning in has an idea of how we qualify some of those terms. So in terms of other background, it might be nice to hear from Thompson and Jen about why we've collaborated on this project, why specifically our two organizations have come together on this cause.
Thanks, Adri. I just wanted to start by sharing a little bit about my personal experience in relation to this issue. I remember that when I first arrived in Australia, one thing that I'm so eager to do was to actually practice and improve my English, because I know that that is an important aspect to integrate much better with the wider community. And guess what? I read a lot of newspapers, and for some reason, the more I read, obviously because I was so eager to improve my English, so the more I read, I found a sense of discomfort in the materials that I've been reading, and I wasn't able to tell why. This is many years ago, and until obviously the whole racism concept comes up and people start to talk about it, I started to realize that this is not right. So coming to the actual question about why we actually collaborate between Asian Australian Alliance and All Together Now on this, I think it's natural for us to collaborate because we're talking about the same issue under the umbrella of racism. And I wanted to point out specifically about why the importance of this research focusing on media, but more specifically in social commentary. Now, not sure if any one of you in the audience here know, but I'm sure that you will be aware of this. Last year, 2019, there's a research by the Australian Communication and Media Authority that shows that media consumers actually expect commentary such as current affairs and also opinion pieces to present the view fairly. Now, this is the research from the authority. This is not my words, okay? Now, that tells us a very serious problem here, because if people are expecting opinion pieces to be news, then it actually gives a lot of freedom for damages and possible damages such as what we're seeing here, racial discriminations, to actually happen. And I must say that media personalities, influencers are actually pretty powerful in that sense. And I don't think people talk a lot about this. Another two things I wanted to bring here is actually two arguments from former Prime Minister of Australia. One is Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, and second is actually a former Labor Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. And people know that Rudd recently call for a royal commission into media ownership. Now, obviously, I think there's a very serious issues here about media diversity. But the point I'm trying to make here is that you can't address the issue of racism without addressing the issue of media racism, because media plays an influential role in educating and shaping people's mindset and people's perception about things, because these are the things that we read every day. And if there's something wrong with the information, then I think something will go really wrong with the society and the perception on how we see things. I'll stop there.
Jen, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I mean, that's such a comprehensive answer. Thanks, Thompson, and thanks for sharing your personal experience as well. I think it's so important. Our work at All Together Now is always evidence-based, and we're looking at what's happening in the media landscape, analysing media discourse. But of course, it's really important to look at how that operates in context and how it impacts affected communities. So working with the Alliance, we're obviously a grassroots organisation, made a lot of sense. And the work that the Alliance has been doing in the Racism Incident Report survey surrounding COVID-19, I think demonstrated to us that there was a strong positive correlation between the kind of media that we were analysing and the racist discourse operating there, and the incidents of interpersonal racism that were being recorded by the Alliance. So that's where it came from our end.
Fantastic. So there's a lot of synergies in the kind of work that both of our organisations are doing, and this will be really palpable when you take a look at the report. So if you haven't already, make sure you go to the link and download that and have a read. But perhaps now we can delve a little bit deeper into the report. So both Thompson and Jen talked about the social commentary that has been really important in the media and how that's shifted public perceptions and public behaviour. So I think the most pertinent question is, why focus on social commentary? And perhaps I can go to Deliana and Megan in the first instance to perhaps address that issue and why that was core to the methodology.
I think, shall I take that one? I think so. One of the first reasons, and perhaps the simplest, is that we do have limited resources. We are quite a small organisation. But in addition to that, just to go back to what Thompson was saying, we know from previous research done that opinion pieces are believed often to have the validity and legitimacy of actual news pieces. And because of that, I don't think we can underestimate the impact that they can and do have on public opinion. So in short, it's a combination of the fact that we do need to draw a line somewhere in our research, and also because of that, undeniable impact that opinion pieces have as social commentary.
So Deliana, did you want to add anything further to that?
Thanks, Megan. Thank you, Adri. No, I think that summarizes pretty well why we look at social commentary. Yeah, indeed, as Megan said, when you do research on such a huge pool of data, you do have to limit that research to a certain sample. That's where we drew the line. And yeah, as both Thompson and Megan said, it's important to remember that there's research showing people actually trust opinion media. They expect factual information. And I think we have to hold them accountable. We have to hold accountable the media for that.
Can I add something to that, Adri, as well? I think just seconding what both Megan and Deliana have said, we see in social commentary, I suppose, on paper, there's this idea that social commentary doesn't necessarily have to stick to the facts. And yet research such as that from the ACMA demonstrates that people treat it and consume it like it does. And that's really problematic, because social commentators have this widespread influence. We see that in someone like Andrew Bold and his rhetoric around multiculturalism in Victoria at the moment, and the ways in which dog whistles can be used to incite fear across the community, perhaps in a way that they wouldn't get away with doing so in the news landscape.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that insight. It's really valuable to hear what the power social commentary can have from the perspective of research. Perhaps then, why have we looked at News Corp and Sydney Morning Herald publications specifically in the report? I think it follows on that they tend to have wide-reaching audiences, but why specifically these media sources, and what is it in the social commentary within these sources that has been key in the research?
I can take that one, Adri. I think really for us, it's a readership issue. So our media monitoring, we basically read the opinion sections of the most read newspapers, and that is both print and online. And these are the Australian, the Age, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Courier Mail, the Daily Telegraph, and the Herald Sun. And we also watch current affairs programs with the highest television ratings. Now, this is taken from Roy Morgan statistics that indicate that the most read mastheads are run by these two companies, News Corp and Nine. So basically, this case study takes a sample from those to show how racism is operationalized through covert language and techniques. But I think this raises really important questions about the concentration of Australian media ownership. And this has been really topical in the past few weeks with the petition launched that Thompson mentioned earlier by former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd calling for a royal commission into media ownership. We know that News Corp publications constantly perpetuate racist content and ideas. And in our media monitoring work this year, in our broad sample, we found that 90% of all racist content was published across 3 newspapers. That was the Australian, the Daily Telegraph, and the Herald Sun. And these are all News Corp publications. So I think the concentration of media ownership in Australia, it undermines the notion of democracy, as Rudd has pointed out, and it brings into scrutiny notions of free speech and open debate. But I think it's also really important to understand it as a racial justice issue, and our data attests to that.
I think that's really interesting, and tying it to the recent survey petition that Rudd put out has been really interesting in the discourse of media and ownership more broadly, and its effect on readership. On that vein, then, there's been a lot of conversation about the Racial Discrimination Act and to what degree this is sufficient to address the current media situation, media ownership situation, and the repercussions of the behaviour that happens as a result of reading the social commentary in the media. Perhaps I can point to Melina in the first instance to talk about this and what advocacy efforts are in the space, what need there is to perhaps review the Racial Discrimination Act, and what Asian Australian Alliance are doing in that space, because there's been a lot of movement there, which ties in very nicely to this media project. And I think they coincide very nicely in addressing kind of the two sides of the conversation. So pass that over to you, Melina, to explore that a little bit more.
Thanks, Adri. I think generally there are concerns about the effectiveness of RDA generally and the redressal available. We have touched upon that in our report and the recommendations of our report as well, and also a national approach towards this. There are state acts as well as the Federal Act, and the kind of the interplay between that and the bodies that administer those acts as well. So there's a lot of confusion amongst the respondents for our report who couldn't understand where to go, what redressal was available, who to go to, and things like that. So there's that general confusion's already there. Then the other thing in terms of what we're discussing today is if it's really difficult to prove the direct nexus between the words and their effects. And that may be exacerbated by the reliance on a number of exceptions in the Act, which allow for some actions if they are done reasonably and in good faith, and also words that reflect a genuinely held belief. So this type of racism is particularly nuanced or covert and tends to blur the lines between legitimate political criticism and racism. And that's why it's difficult to bring it within the purview of the Act. The report highlights some of the tactics and devices that are used by these, the publishers, like irony, stereotyping, etc., used by these commentators to justify the narrative, and that makes it even more difficult. We have also seen in the past efforts to dilute sections of the RDA to allow for greater freedom of speech. So we cannot really rely on that to change the systemic, to bring about a systemic change. Because that really is important something that legislation cannot always bring about. Where the media remains largely dominated by white cultural norms that promote racist narrative, the correlation between racist opinion pieces and the cultural background of the author will continue to exist and can only be fixed by implementing some of the recommendations of this report. And so I think that work that we've been doing at the Asian Australian Alliance and some of the recommendations from our report in terms of media reporting and having more cultural diversity in the media and other the similar kind of recommendations can assist with in bringing about this change. And this is what this report also talks about. So I think there's that synergy in the work that we've been doing and with this report. Yes, I'll pass it on to someone else to comment further on that.
I'll quickly jump in if that's okay. Look, I think there are talk about having a national anti-racism strategy, but we think that it is important to have a subsection, a national anti-media racism strategy as part of that overall strategy. Because as I said, media is just part of that ecosystem, and if you don't address the issues that is causing, and Kevin Rudd used the word cancer in the democracy, right? And if you use the word cancer, which means it's something very, very serious. So I think that's one thing, but it is also pleasing to see, like, we don't know where the Royal Commission, the Murdoch Royal Commission that Rudd was calling for, where is that heading? But one thing is pleasing to see, and I've recently observing on social media, is that people started to have that awareness about the issue in media, and people started to call up. I was watching the Australian Post, and I saw some of the top comments that received the most number of likes are actually people calling out, saying that, hey, the Australian, this post is not right. So I think it's good to see that grassroots awareness. And I think this is a very positive step that, people like ourselves and people who are working in this space should actually be pleased on. Obviously, there's a long journey to go, but I think it's a positive to very see positive things happening at the moment.
Fantastic. Thank you, Melina and Thompson. I think that there is a common thread here that functioning in the greys of policy and language have actually been instrumental in ceding power to these media organizations and these areas of social commentary. And often we get the feedback, and I can see the questions coming in sort of the vein of, isn't public discourse often a reflection of the political discourse? And if so, what recommended limits on what politicians can say? There's also questions here about whether the Australian media represents Australians. And I think Thompson said that, there's a little bit of a challenge of that. But if the media is racist, what does that say for the rest of us? I'd like to point to Erin to talk about this space a little bit more, because she has been working in the area and has wide connections with legislators and policymakers in this space, and what the sentiment is at the legislative level about what constituents are reporting back to their representatives. What does that look like? How do politicians view the issue at the moment? We've had a couple of conversations with the Asian Australian Alliance already in seeding these ideas and feeding through information from the report and from our survey over the past few months. But it's certainly been a really a constantly changing landscape. So over to Erin just to talk a bit about that space.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you to Megan, Jen, and Deliana from All Together Now for joining us today on this panel discussion and this launch. And I think like just echoing what Adri just mentioned, the whole idea of what's going on in that political landscape is extremely important, and also looking at how do we engage with legislators and with our politicians and with those who are meant to represent us in our electorates, and how does that reflect with the media? And I think it's also good to kind of just take the example, and a very more recent example that we will take is looking at the situation where the recent Senate hearing in which actually looked at the issues that are impacting on the different diasporas. And obviously there were 3 witnesses who were of Asian descent talking about the Asian diaspora. And one of them, Osman Chu, happens to be our co-collaborator on our COVID-19 racism survey, but also a close friend of mine for almost 15 years. And so his topic was basically discussing the lack of cultural representation in Australian politics, and I guess the response and the reaction from those like Senator Eric Abetz was quite disturbing and very concerning in terms of him then steering the conversation and asking the 3 witnesses, so the 3 of them who were of Chinese descent, whether they would publicly condemn the Chinese Communist Party. Now, all of us can have different views on the Chinese Communist Party. You know, we all understand that we can condemn the human rights issues, as well as the growing influence of, you know, the Chinese government and the Communist Party. But why does it have to fall on us to condemn the party? It should be a choice that we make, not something that is forced upon us. And when you do that, it's a form of othering. It's also a form of saying that we are just perpetual foreigners, and just because of our skin color, we must, you know, condemn a government that many of us really have no linkage or connections with. And even if we do, it is a personal choice whether we want to condemn it or not. So, and then I guess there's this whole idea of the power of social media and how you can engage with politicians through that through pressure, you know, through getting others, you know. So a lot of us are pressuring, you know, the politicians, particularly those from the same political parties as Eric Abetz, you know, which is the Australian government, to condemn those comments. And to their credit, there were quite a number that came out. You know, Andrew Bragg came out against, you know, those comments. And if you guys look at the recent SBS news clip, there is he is actually talking about why these type of comments are wrong, as well as Fiona Martin, who is the member for Reid, and she also spoke out against that. And I think it's very powerful when we can get politicians to use that their platform to speak out. But one thing we need to remember, and I won't take too much more time, I just want to mention this one point, is that legislators and politicians have a lot of power in terms of influencing the public discussion. And as we can see, what is said by these politicians is reflected on what the media reports. So we can see that majority are pretty much on side that Eric Abetz's comments were inappropriate. And that there should be, you know, I see a comment talking about, you know, more neutrality, and that's totally true. There should be more neutrality going around. But then you have these other media outlets, such as, you know, Andrew Bolt's platform now on Sky News, where he will attack, our communities, you know, for the benefit of themselves, and those listeners then will spread that message. So it's important that we need to keep the media accountable for their actions. And where we do believe in free speech also comes with a lot of responsibilities and accountabilities.
Thank you, Erin. I think that ties in nicely with a question that we've got from the audience. Now that we're talking about different platforms and the responsibility of the media, this person asked, with a predominant uptake of mainstream media consumed online via social and other platforms, is there a responsibility to owners of such platforms to work on algorithms and work on broader strategies to eradicate and minimize the racist narrative? Now, I'd like to open this up to the panel more broadly, because I think it points to an important question of the middleman and the filtering between media sources and the audiences audiences. So if we are concerned about readership and audiences, what responsibility do these middle players have in promoting this kind of racist rhetoric? And should we be considering, further advocacy in this space to encourage them to have more responsibility? Who would like to take first stabs at that question? Maybe Jen?
I'm happy to start us off. I guess the short answer is yes, there is a responsibility there. And we've seen recently that there's not just a responsibility, but there's a capability for online platforms to monitor the content that is being put out there. We've seen that with platforms deplatforming, for example, racist content put forward by extremist groups in the US. I think more broadly, there's a question about media regulation at play. So yes, there's a responsibility within the industry, and our report makes recommendations to that effect. But as well, we have a media regulatory landscape in Australia that is really in need of review. And Altogether Now in the past has done quite a bit of work in this area. In our 2019 report, we recommended that media regulatory bodies like the Australian Press Council, which regulate newspapers both in print and online, insert binding standards that relate to race. These standards actually existed in the past, and they were removed a couple of years ago, and it's still quite unclear to us why they were taken out. We also recommended, for example, that the 30-day timeline for making complaints should be extended, because in the online landscape, news media is available for extended periods of time, and we feel that audiences should have the ability to report racist or otherwise offensive content for longer than 30 days. We met with the Australian Press Council and put forward these recommendations, which then went to their council, and in February we were told that they were rejected. So we're still working in this space and talking to other organisations about what can be done, again, to make sure that platforms that are promoting content, and again, regulators as well, are actively making sure that content is not racist and where possible anti-racist as well.
And I just want to add on to what Jen mentioned, and I'd like to also take note that I was part of a consultation process by a think tank called the Responsible Technology Australia, who are actually doing a centered submission in terms of looking at the accountability social media platforms have in terms of allowing a lot of, racist content, and that also includes media. And as I said before, it is important that, there is free speech, because we're all, in a liberal democratic society. So we do believe in free speech, but we also need to remember that that comes with responsibilities and accountabilities. And if you are saying something that's racist, saying something that offends a religious or any cultural group or gender group, then you need to be held accountable, and you need to accept that you need to be held accountable. And I think just kind of following on from that, I do want to answer, there's a question here on the Q&A, I guess going on from the Abetz thing about what result would the panel like to see come out of the Furor with Eric Abetz. And I think, obviously having a lot of long conversations with the three witnesses, but also working close with Osmond and having that discussion, we are wanting Abetz to admit that what he said was inappropriate, because it is, and B, him, actually apologizing first and foremost to the three witnesses who were put, on the stand basically, and asked that question to condemn the CCP. So I think those are kind of like the steps, but also to get the other government MPs and senators, particularly the MPs who represent large Asian, constituents, so electorates with a huge Asian population, to come out and speak against that. And that includes people like Gladys Liu, who represents the, can't remember what the electorate's called, but it's that Box Hill area in Melbourne, who hasn't come out and said anything yet, but is to put that pressure on. And it's all about putting a lot of social media pressure on that.
Thank you so much, Erin. So unfortunately, we've run out of time, and I see that there's still a couple of questions waiting to be answered. So if you'd like us to get back to you, please send them through to info@asianaustralianalliance.net, and we'll certainly get back to you on those specific questions. But otherwise, please join me in thanking all of our panelists. We can't hear you or see you, so please put clap emojis and thank yous in the chat box so that our panelists can feel the love and get some extra, I guess, feel the support in the important but difficult work that we're doing in advocating for better neutrality in the media. So just recap there that the two main recommendations that have come out of the report is more cultural competency, particularly in our newsrooms, and of course, increasing diversity at all levels of the media. So we'll take that on board. If you look at your screen, you'll see that there is a QR code where you can go and download the report. I recommend that you do and take a read through all of the recommendations and the explanation of the methodology. Our partners at Altogether Now have done such a fantastic job in tying this together, not just with Asian Australian Alliance, but the other collaborators they have in the academic and media space. So stay tuned, as mentioned by Jen, Deliana and Megan, there is so much more work to be doing. Asian Australian Alliance is focusing on a lot more advocacy work kind of around the space in scaffolding a lot of the recommendations that have been put forward. So please stay in touch. The website and emails for both of our organizations are online. And thank you again for joining us this Friday afternoon. Have a great weekend. So we'll be staying online just a little bit longer so that people can capture all that information. Take a screenshot if you'd like.
Okay, I think that should be okay. We can go. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Weekend.